people are complicated. And I think where we can get blind to this, because as we think about human relationships, like you can't say this, you can't say that, human behavior will continue to be rubbish. It always will be. Less, you hope it wouldn't be, but it would, the likelihood it will always be there. But what you can do is try and create the circumstances and the narratives that enable opportunity to be as wide as possible.
Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm joined by Nick Petche, Editor-in-Chief of Yahoo UK. Nick has worked as a journalist for more than 30 years, including time spent across the world in Central America, covering Mexico, the civil war in Guatemala, and as a reporter and photographer. He's worked for some of the most well-known UK regional and national news organisations, including the Reading Evening Post, Ealing Gazette, Metro, Daily Mail, and the Mail Online. Earlier this year, he led the editorials team's coverage during Yahoo's partnership with Brighton Pride, amongst a number of other great initiatives, including with the UN Refugee Agency, focusing on the life in the Za'atari refugee camp. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful intro there. Much appreciated.
Well, I did my best, not only because I'm dyslexic and pronouncing some of these names, as well as the host of things that you've done in your career. The pressure was on me, Nick. But tell me a little bit more about you for our audience that perhaps don't know you as well as I do. A whistle-stop tour, or a large whistle-stop tour, I should say, throughout, what have been some tremendous years working in journalism and doing great things and sharing meaningful stories.
I mean, look, I've been very fortunate. I've had still working in journalism. It's given me a lot of fun. It's given me a lot of opportunities to do things and see things and some traveling. So born in Manchester, spent 3 years in Canada, came back to Manchester, then moved to the south coast near Portsmouth. At about 7, went to school near there, went to comprehensive school, then sixth form, then traveled to the Middle East, worked there for about 6-7 months, came back, went to uni in Warwick, first generation to go to uni, and then went traveling to Central America, started teaching English and German, and then got into journalism. And then spent 2 years there, and then about 8-9 months in Guatemala. Then came back and trained as a journalist in Portsmouth, doing the NCTJ course. Then got a job in Maidenhead on a weekly paper. Then stayed there for a few years. Then went to Ealing, and then went to Willesden, and then went to Maidenhead, and then went to Reading, and then went to Metro. From Metro to the Mail, from the Mail to the Mail Online. And 10 years ago, I joined Yahoo. Well, nearly 11 years ago, Yahoo. And Yahoo's been through lots of iterations as a company. It's going through more iterations now, but it's now owned by Apollo, which is a private equity firm. And lots of positive things are happening, very exciting things and very forward things, very clear vision of where we want to go. And it's an exciting time to be at the company. And it's also allowed me and my colleagues to do some of the initiatives, which has kind of brought me into contact with you, which is to try and do, our bit in this particular space.
Well, thanks so much, Nick, and talk about a whistle-stop tour. If I may dive into part of this story, one of the things that really resonated when we met in real life, or IRL now as the cool saying goes, apparently, you said to me, I've always had an eye for the underdog, and I walked away thinking, do you know what, that's such a great expression. I think is one of the reasons why we really connected was having that multicultural but really quite different background. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about your childhood, because I think the tenacity and the resilience, certainly in the kind of, you know, as you casually explained, the last 30 years of working for these big branded organizations, and obviously now working for Yahoo, almost trip straight off your tongue. And, you know, we spoke about this kind of, you know, the deep sense of, you know, tenacity and, you know, of course, sense of social justice, given some of your background, and really how that's then almost fed into the career, that, you know, that personal life.
Yeah, I think it's funny. It's when someone points something out that you go, oh yeah. Like I think you just, if you live it, you live it, and you kind of get on with it. I guess so. My mother's Hungarian German, which is it, for most English people, British people, it gets quite nebulous Central European, but like a bit like Sudetenland, like the parts of Hungary, Austro-Hungarian Empire were quite German. And then at the end of the war, almost as retribution, the German community was forced out of the village, so they became refugees and ended up in southern Germany. So, and they were a Protestant community and ended up in a Catholic village. It's a very, very small village in southern Germany. So, and they spoke a type of German that was not native to that, like very heavily accented. But so they were outsiders, but from religion, outsiders in how they spoke, outsiders to a degree how they dressed. So there's an outsider bit there. I think she came to the UK, met my father. My father's side of the family, very, my grandparents on both sides, very poor, agricultural workers from Hungarian sort of, you know, very, very, you know, crofters is what they call, like you pay for the land through what you make off the land. And then on my father's side, it was very much, you know, generations of pub owners, sailors, sometimes policemen, but very sort of working class. And then, you know, we led a quite a middle class lifestyle. And then, as I said, first generation to go to university. That was a big deal. Education is obviously often with immigrant families a big deal, and it was certainly with us as well. And I think, and then also me being sort of, no one understands Hungarian German, understand German. So being German in the 70s and 80s is not cool. You know, you've got the whole World War II legacy, and, you know, some sort of a jokey kind of thing. Don't mention the war, you know, all that kind of stuff. But it has a different resonance in Central Europe and in Germany than it does here. And so and I was brought up bilingually, so I can speak German. And sometimes when you're in Germany, you feel very English, and when you're in England, you feel very German, and you don't really feel you're in one or the other. And it's a sense of where you fit in and belong is something that's always fascinated me. And even Hungarians themselves, a lot of really famous photographers are Hungarians, and there was an exhibition about how its location in Europe and this kind of the uniqueness of the language means it's kind of a why some people are drawn to photography, because it helps to understand and to process and give you a sense of distance from what you're looking at. So I think that explains the sort of detachedness. And I think the bit about the underdog is, I think, you know, if people go to private school education, everyone has to make their own choices, and I don't judge people necessarily for that, because in different parts of the country you have to make different choices depending on what's available, and in some areas it's not great, because then think about parental choice, it doesn't really exist. Like, you have to go where you go, and if you've got money you can go somewhere else. But I think one of the benefits of going through the state system, and also in mixed, you know, where boys and girls are mixed, is you do see different facets of society, and you are aware that people have different lives. You know, my wife works in education. She works in child protection and in special educational needs. And I'm very, very aware of how vulnerable and fragile some people's lives are. And then as a journalist working in local journalism, I'm a big advocate of local journalism. And when I worked at the Maiden Advertiser, it was a brilliant newspaper. This was before the internet took off and all the money from classified ads like cars and property left. And they were profitable organizations. And it was a brilliant, and I'm sure it still is a brilliant newspaper. It was a well looked after newspaper, really good editors, really good staff. I learned a lot. And it really mattered to the community. And it's important for democracy. I cannot underscore how important it is that people are informed, and that someone goes to magistrates court and sees who's in court, and then they go to the council and report on what the council's doing in education or in social, in social provision, in libraries, older people. It binds people together, and there are lots of positives with the internet. I work for an internet company. That's how I earn my bread, but there are also negatives, with social media platforms that have corroded those opportunities, enhancing some, but corroded in others. So I think, being a journalist is a real privilege. It's very hard to make it work, and I've had a very fortunate career. I'm fortunate to keep working, but it's also it's fantastic to be able to see and experience other people's lives and to talk to people. I don't get to do it that much these days, but I always enjoy talking to people and hearing about people's lives. It's fascinating, and there are a lot of common threads. I've been lucky to travel to various places around the world, and what most people want is the same. They want a roof over their heads, they want food, they want to be able to provide for their families, and they want children to get an education, and they want to live in peace. That's what most people want. And unfortunately, we haven't quite figured a way to do that for most people on the planet. But hope springs eternal.
I like the way that you describe your curiosity, which of course is anything, everything needed to be a successful journalist. But I also particularly liked how you described the importance of belonging, which I truly believe sits at the heart of all aspects of diversity, is that human need to want to fit in or to belong to something, whatever that may be. And when you were describing, the personal background and the multicultural background, the diversity of organizations you've worked for, I was envisaging like a chameleon here, is actually in one circle of, working class, then do I need to be behaving a certain way when around others, in order to fit the mold of, certain type of education, private public school education, and the likes, or then being German, when back then you said being German wasn't necessarily cool. Now actually it's totally cool to celebrate, where one's background is from, and that concept and that human need is something that is truly fascinating. And then you spoke as well almost about kind of Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, it's the classical one, isn't it, from psychology books, is the fundamental human need being very similar. And I guess the same is that in the sense of belonging and not wanting to necessarily stand out up until the point that you realize, actually, do you know what? Famous quote says, why not be myself, because everyone else is taken. But if I revert back, so you were born in Altrincham, then been to Canada, Portsmouth, interesting family background, then to Warwick, which is a great place, obviously, because I'm biased and near there. Then Berlin, back to UK. Your wife, has got a super interesting, very different background. You've got the two girls, the cat called Socks that you didn't mention in the intro. And fast forward to now, where you really have this opportunity to make a fundamental impact within Yahoo, a forward-thinking digital media organization. Talk to me about what has changed now over journalism over the last couple of years, and then maybe we could slide into talking about the fact that you co-founded the Yahoo Diversity in Journalism bursary scheme.
Yeah, I think so that scheme, we now are part of the Journalism Diversity Fund, which is part of the National Council for the Training of Journalists, which is the body that trains and monitors the training of journalists. And that's a fund that has support from all the big organizations, Reuters, FT, BBC, and Telegraph, Times, UK, and News UK, and we're part of that as well. And they do research every year, and there's 27 organizations in that, and the JDF, which is similar to what we were doing before we merged into it, which is they provide bursaries for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether it's for health reasons or ethnicity reasons or whatever reasons. You go before a panel, you have to justify why you want that, and then you get funding. They've done that for about 500 people now, and 90% of those people have now got jobs in journalism. And that initiative is only really launched in 2005. But I think journalism, the pace of change has picked up. And I think it's a complicated area, this, and I don't pretend to have the answers. I think it's, as you mentioned earlier, the chameleon aspect of it. We alter our voice and how we behave in certain circumstances. I do it now. I would imagine my accent and voice is quite hard to position, like pinpoint exactly where he's from. But if I spoke a certain way, you might think, oh, he went to a certain type of school. And, and that it's even with white men. Like if you speak a certain way, you get pigeonholed. If you speak with a Brummy accent, with a Scottish or Welsh accent, so there's pigeonholes in that, in all those things, and that's how humans are. They make these judgment calls. I think one of the things that's really good about Yahoo, and this project I started with my colleague Stuart Henderson 6 years ago, was that we were allowed the opportunity to do this. And like the reason why we were talking about this, and we're both white, I'm a little bit older than him, and we looked around, we could see that in newsrooms, a lot of people look like us. And the question to ask is like, what are you missing out on? And you're missing out on those voices, you're missing out on those experiences that make the organization stronger and healthier. And there is a cost attached to those, everyone missing out on that. And there is a benefit to incorporating that. Therefore, if you have an opportunity to do something, you try and do it. And I think that's the benefit of the organization. And in any organization, you have to have someone who's willing to back you. And I was lucky that my boss, Mary-Hélène, she backed us to do this. And the people above us she's still here, but but a lot of people have changed. So you have to be steadfast with the idea of what you're trying to achieve. And I think the thing that we set out to do is that, and having spoken to people from different ethnic backgrounds, because we didn't kind of go, well, we know the answer. We went and spoke to, they have these ERGs, employee resource groups in the company, and we said, look, hi, we would like to do this. Is this a good idea? And what would be a good way of going about it? And having got the feedback, we decided to do one, which is like, we find someone, we train them for 6 months, we put them on the same course that all the other journalists at the FT, the Times, and the rest go. So if they finish that course, which means shorthand, law, public affairs, how to write, they pass, then they can hold their heads high and they know they're just as good as anyone else. Like there's no difference, there's no making it easier or anything. Like it's just as tough. And then if they pass out, then we would offer them a 6-month contract. So they get the two things they're always asked for: training and experience. And we've had about 7 or 8 people go through. Some people were unable to finish the course because it's a really tough course. And a couple of people have done really well. One woman's now working on Sky. She's on TV. She's done incredibly well. Another woman's working at Jeremy Vine. Another one's freelancing at Telegraph. Another woman's working in financial journalism. And even the people that didn't finish the course passed on that they were grateful. And I found out one of them recommended what we did to somebody else because it was that good, but they benefited from it. And that's the thing about education. It sticks with you for life. So it's about trying to do something that I kind of feel it's an onus on all of us, because the industry still is has challenges. Looking at the report, I looked at it last night. Gender wise, it's almost, there's parity, with men and women. The proportion of women in senior roles is slightly higher than across other industry areas. Age is similar to other industry areas. Ethnicity, 80% of journalists are white. There's some improvement there, but obviously there's still a ways to go. With health and disability, there's 19%, which is 17% for most UK workers. Qualification level, high qualification levels. The area that's the biggest challenge now is social class. That's the big challenge, because to be able to withstand being paid not very much, especially in regional newspapers, you need someone to help you out. And it's a real barrier, I earn a good wage now, but I've only been here 10 years. And before that, I did okay. But I wasn't until my 30s that I started working for national papers that I was earning a decent wage. And at that point, I had a family. So if someone wants to have a family or whatever, they need. And so it does mean that you end up with a higher proportion of privately educated children in those roles, through connections, through the financial ability to withstand the difficult years where you're not making headway, to then make headway. So that's a challenge. And the problem with that is if you lack that diversity of thought, you're only hearing the same voices, you're only feeding the same narratives, and you're missing out on what's going on out there. You're not tapping into that. So, as in my team, one of my team came up with a good idea. We have a number of providers on our site who come from regional press. We want to give that more exposure. What's going on in the Northeast, what's going on in the Northwest, what's going on in the Southwest. A lot of those regions, when you come to the thing that's shredding our economy and now with, Brexit, I didn't vote for it. And I've campaigned, with my people I came into contact with against it, not through the company, against. I think it's fundamentally a very bad idea. But that's where we are. That's the decision we've made. But I'm still interested. I spoke to even neighbors who voted for it. And I said, well, why? And when you speak to people, you hear it's a frustration that they're not being heard. Their views are not being represented. And then they are open to being fed lines that are not necessarily correct. And it's the same with certain parts of the country. You look at certain parts of the country which voted for Brexit, were areas that were getting big chunks of EU subsidies, but they were not being heard. They were not being listened to. So, we all have a role to play. You look at what happened with the Euros, with the women's football team. That was transformative to see women, mainstream TV times celebrating, me and my wife were looking at this is wild. You need that kind of lioness in a boardroom. You need it in your organization. As you mentioned, I have two daughters. I know the world I want them to grow up in, and I know the world I don't want them to grow in. And my industry is changing, but there are elements of machismo. It's quite male dominated. It's very hard for women to make headway. And that needs to be dealt with. You have to bring men with you, but you have to it's like I said, it's complicated. It's hard. I find it hard. It's stressful, to figure out how you go about doing it. And I don't think I'm the only one who finds it that way. I think a lot of people find it hard to navigate. Society's moved very, very quickly. And we're all, through our background, through our socialization, we're all forged in different crucibles. And that means that we all have different perspectives. And we're going to bang up against things. And you have to deal with it. But you have to stop with a point where you go, I don't know it all. We're all sinners to a degree, and we have to figure this out. I don't know what it's like to be followed around a store by a store detective just because of my skin color. I don't know what it's like to be stopped by a policeman when I'm driving a car because of my skin color. I've spoken to people who have experienced that, and I know that's not right. I know that I've spoken to people who've had hurtful things to them because of their gender, because of their diversity, LGBT. You don't want people to go through life through hurtful things. You want people to lead fulfilled life. You want them to be able to have happiness. You want them to be able to work. You want them to be able to, you know, to not live in fear. And that's something that, you know, I think we're in the foothills of that change. It's moved very quickly. There were things that were said when I was growing up that were wrong, and they weren't called out. You wouldn't say them now, but back then you would, and people like laugh about it, and, you know, oh, that's funny. It would be on TV even, and it was wrong then. It's wrong now, but it wasn't called out. It is called out now, and I think it's good, that change. And I think, you know, the younger generation in some ways are ahead of us. There are some things where I think maybe the judgmental aspect is a little bit too quick. But I think we're at the start of this, and there's a long, long way to go. We all make judgments. And I think, you know, we all know, though, what people shouldn't experience. And if you have an opportunity to do something, you do it. And you do it for as long as you can. And like, as you said, like at Yahoo, we got an opportunity to do this 6-7 years ago. We came together, we put this plan to action, we brought some people through. Now we're part of the JDF and the NCTJ. So I sit on panels assessing people. I mentor people. And then when we get internships, we try and bring people in from those organizations as well. And we, you know, it's about giving someone a chance. But it's, like I said, it's the cost of not dealing with this and the opportunity that we're missing if we don't have the right people in the virtual room.
My goodness, there's so many things there that I desperately want to unpick. But one thing that wove throughout everything that you were saying there is really it's the opportunity gap, right? When you strip everything else away, whatever diversity means, and diversity means many different things to many different people, the same way that you have, you know, a rich and diverse background. So do I. I'm the adopted Chinese daughter of two white middle-class parents and dyslexic and so on and so forth. So it does mean many different things to many different people. And what you're speaking to is really how can we look at the opportunity gap? How can we look at the barriers that prevent talent, whatever it looks like, above the surface, below the surface, whatever that looks like? How do we keep feeding in that diversity of thought ultimately, and, you know, giving a chance so fundamentally important? And so the mentoring piece that you've done, and I think that was with employee resource groups from different backgrounds, I think is superb. And I also must commend you as well on the diversity in journalism bursary schemes. I think for a legacy like that to live on shows testament to the initiative in a world where we see different things being hot for the press, and you know, people say, oh, you know, say diversity or whatever it might be, is that a fad? Actually having interventions like the bursary scheme that stand the test of time and can still be seen and viewed, and you actually have the return on investment through those that are, you know, say now on the TV and doing great things, as you mentioned there. Now, if I may be a bit provocative, one of the conversations that we spoke about over coffee, and I remember we both got really into it, was, you know, how can white guys be involved in diversity? And we both got really heated about this. And I told my story of the three Steves. And, you know, it's kind of funny on the one hand, but then the other hand of it is actually it's super serious. And I remember you saying, you know, a little about social class and the system in the UK being actually so different to the States. But also there is this narrative, and you can see why it is so important when you look at the statistics, is actually poor white kids do get overlooked. And because of a lot of the diversity narratives, quote unquote, is there now this conflicting confusion over what diversity is, what it means, and, you know, I think sometimes it actually leads people to be almost fearful of getting involved. And that is the antithesis of what we want, right?
I think if I'm honest, yeah. I mean, you know, not going to lie, a bit nervous about being here and talking about it now. I think a lot of white middle-aged men would be nervous about talking about diversity and it, you know, and just acknowledging that it is a very, very difficult space to navigate. But like I said earlier, like I can't pretend to be from a different ethnic background. I wouldn't pretend to be. You have to be listen to people and be willing to acknowledge that you won't know everything, but you try. But I do have two daughters, so I do understand something about gender diversity. And as I saw them grow up, I am aware of things that are said, things they have to put up with, they shouldn't have to put up with. That I kind of, to be frank, blew me away that someone would pass in a van and shout something out at a schoolgirl going to school, like that sort of thing would go on. It's just wrong. And then they have friends who are LGBT, and then you see something through another perspective. So I think you can end up in a virtual circle, or whatever the phrase is, where everyone's trying to be more virtuous than the next person, and not signal, or you can just roll up your sleeves and just get on with it. And I'm not going to claim to have all the answers. I don't have the answers, but
That's
all is you do
okay.
is you just try, you do something, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. But I think the people that we've worked with, and like the Yahoo program that is kind of like now ended, and now we subsumed into the NCTJ one. If the BBC and the Reuters and the Telegraph and the News UK and Reach and all those guys, and it's 27, like, well, they're doing something right, and there's some good people in that organization trying hard to do it. And these are complicated things. People are complicated, and I think where we can get blind to this, because as we think about human relationships, like you can't say this, you can't say that, human behavior will continue to be rubbish. It always will be. Less, you hope it wouldn't be, but it would. The likelihood it will always be there. But what you can do is try and create the circumstances and the narratives that enable opportunity to be as wide as possible. And I think there are positive things happening. Like I mentioned, women, like, watching TV last night, and you see, I think it's I can't remember, Arsenal Man United women's game being advertised on on TV, and you're like, well, that didn't happen 30 years ago. That's good, and you see other representations of communities on TV, which is good. Visibility of things. We did Brighton Pride this summer. 400,000 people coming to this city, and that's a good thing. But again, it was interesting with Pride, like, people make assumptions about the LGBT community, where we would reach out to people that we knew who are, and we say, oh, do you want to come along? And they go, well, no, that's the last thing on earth I want to do, is walk down a street. Like, there's an association that just because you are, you want to have, you want a spotlight on you. Well, some people they say, no, I just want to do a bit of gardening and read my book. Like we project. So the thing is, just you go back to being a journalist, like, be curious, sit down, talk to people, listen, be willing to change your mind. And I think there's a lot of difficult stuff going on in the world at the moment, but I think those of us that have the space and the capacity to sit down and listen, and to open up and be prepared that we don't know everything, and be prepared to change our minds, and for other people to change it, that's how you make progress. And it goes a little bit forward, it goes a little bit backwards.
Just having the safe space, Nick, to your point. And even because my parents are, well, I always think of them as actually being in their 40s, even though my dad is nearly 80. He's 80 in January. But partially, I suppose it's a generational piece, but also, as you say, the world is moving so quickly. And I do sometimes worry an awful lot about the narrative of diversity, that there is this huge amount of fear over talking about it, through fear of saying the wrong thing. Now, I've heard it even from my parents, who, are frankly the most inclusive people I can think of. They ended up in Hong Kong, adopted 2 Chinese babies, and the likes. They're far from, being uninclusive, yet still they would say things, and then either, one maybe be like, oh, can I say that these days? I'm not really quite sure. And where there is such a almost judgmental, not only judgmental media, I think just generally everyone has an opinion these days, and of course everyone's voice ought to be heard, but shooting people down for saying things that aren't completely and utterly modern day when it comes to up-to-date language, I really think is wrong. And that is something that really worries me, because let's face it, you know, certain senior individuals don't need to get involved in this conversation. And so we need to encourage them to want to do that, not
Yeah,
through fear.
I think it's I think more people are scared of it than they want to admit, because of what you say. And I think as you get older, then you also refuse. Well, I personally refuse to be afraid. So I it's not you're going out of the way to annoy anyone. You're just like, you stand your ground. I think there are other circumstances that feed into this. So I think COVID has had a massive impact on people's behavior. I don't think we fully understand that. So I think, the fact that we're all shut away in our homes, it's exacerbated certain levels of anxiety. Everyone's struggled with it on some level. Um, it's been extraordinarily tough. I think when you look at social media, the spirals that go on there, the pylons, that thing, like where everyone's, even when the George Floyd murder took place, everyone's very, very fearful of saying the wrong thing, you know, and it's so people retreat. And I think then you have the strident voices in the room rather than the moderate voices in the room.
Yeah.
And and then when people hear the strident voices, then people get even more scared. They go, okay, do I have to go with that voice? Or because that's not really what I feel. And then they keep quiet. So I think it's hopefully with COVID, I mean, it's still around, but I think as the world kind of opens up a bit more, hopefully we have more interaction. That's why interactions with people are so critical, to meet people and to sit down. And it's almost like the thing about breaking bread and having a meal with someone and talk. When you talk to someone, their narratives are very different to what you perceive it is on a, like what you might read in a tweet or on Instagram or whatever like that. And I think, like, for instance, I always found it interesting, because fan background, like people, when you meet people who experienced the Second World War, in my experience, whenever you met, particularly when you do, like, golden weddings or people obits or whatever, you speak to the relatives or people who've lived through that era, particularly soldiers who've lived through this or seen fighting, and you talk to them. In my experience, those individuals are rarely gung-ho, jingoistic, stick it to the whatever. They're normally quite reticent, they're quite soft, quiet, careful. They've seen it, horrible things. It's the people who did national service, who never saw any active service, the people that came, who were on the fringes of it, that are the most mouthy about it. And it's like, that seems to echo down time. The people on the fringes of it, not people really experience it, who tend to be the most vocal. So I think it's
That's so true. And I
I
bet
think
people are listening are thinking, yeah, I know some of those, in which and whatever context. Obviously talk about diversity, but
yeah,
we all know those people, don't we? Where it's like, well, have you really had the experience
yeah. And it's, if
yourself?
you claim something, no one is a bit like the emperor's clothes. No, it takes some of the point out, well, do you really know about that? And are you, and it's a bit, like, and you were asking, I think your colleague was asking, like, what do I have any heroes? I don't like having heroes, because I used to have heroes as a kid, and then you look into them and you go, oh yeah, okay, well, they were into the slave trade. That's not very good, is it? Or they did, like, we've all got feet of clay, right? We've all, like, I mean, that's obviously an extreme example, but like, but it's I think, there's, in my experience, I've very, very rarely met a truly evil, bad person, and I've very, very rarely met a truly wonderful, good person. Most people are in the middle. They do good things most of the time, and every now and then do stupid things, right? Or they do something wrong. Like, that's in my experience. Other people might have a different experience. So I kind of think, you know, a bit of forgiveness, a trick of trying to understand, and if it gets too loud and shouty, then just step back for a while, and things do tend to correct over time. I think, I think the passion around, wanting to deal with climate change is just and right. The sense, if you're from a different ethnic background, particularly, like you want change, like you wouldn't want your children to have experienced what you have experienced. It's wrong. It's just wrong, and it needs to stop. It needs to stop quickly. Those things, that passion for that has to stay, and you do what you can do.
Really well said, Nick. And being conscious of time here, because I don't want to make you late for your next meeting. But I do really want to very quickly call out a piece that I've read in The Guardian. And I thought of you at the time, actually, because I remember you'd said, when we were talking about the complexities of diversity, and it is really complex, social class and the system and such. And we were speaking about white individuals in the community from underprivileged backgrounds. And anyhow, this piece in The Guardian that I read was it was pretty depressing, actually. It was talking about the worst performers being white Irish traveller children, who then would have been called white Gypsy Roma children, both of which the school and the education system has failed by a long chalk. Following that was then mixed race children with Caribbean backgrounds, then white British, so on and so forth. And then there's a little bit more about there being a slight uptick for other races like Chinese and Indian children. And just reading the article, I mean, yes, number one, it was quite depressing. Number two, it's amazing then how we're just breaking everything down by ethnicity. But also, I think it's a really important piece of research from the sense that actually the UK has so many different types of communities, and Ireland for that matter, this richness of different cultures because of the very nature of Great Britain. And so diversity, it just means so many different things. And so we got to look under the surface of what we might perceive as stereotypical diversity, or what the media, not just the media, certain narratives may have made us believe over recent times.
Yeah, I think it's I think that's a whole, another, like, you're right about the traveler community, and I don't know an awful lot about it, but I think again it comes down to interaction. Like you took, I remember reading a while back about how, back in the 60s and 70s or even the 50s, people would do door-to-door sales from that community, so people would interact and they would understand who they were and how it was. And I think, and then as time progressed, councils wouldn't apportion land for them to live, and they have huge suicide rates in the traveller community, particularly, I mean, male suicide is awful, but particularly in that community. And I've forgotten what they have a word for it, and they call it the tremors or something. Like it's a terrible, terrible issue, and a lot of it's to do with the inability to keep moving, which is just how that community lives. So when they haven't got a place, then they move into areas like they do in Brighton. They move into parks, and that annoys people because, well, hang on, why are they in our park? And they haven't got a place to go. And then the friction points start up, and so that then it pushes people away instead of bringing people together. And I think, it's I think I can, well, I know very little. My understanding is you're absolutely right, though. I think that community does deal with an awful lot of prejudice, and that's the traveller community. I think what's interesting is with Irish, like, in the 70s and 80s, being Irish also wasn't very cool. Like, there's a lot of prejudice against Irish people. It was like jokes. It was like, ha ha ha, all that kind of stuff. And then the IRA were very active back then and all that kind of stuff. Now it's very cool, and it's a beautiful accent, and it's a very, it's a warm embrace. I think that's my perception. I mean, I have Irish friends, so that's how I see it. That's shifted, and I think it just shows that things can shift over time. But that's not to negate that, certain communities do have some horrendous difficulties that they deal with.
Indeed. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. And in fact, I feel we could do another podcast actually talking about social mobility. But anyway, I'll do my best to summarize from today because there've been so many rich discussions, intersectionality, the concept of diversity, the changing narrative, the fact that we can all have a part to play, that we must not succumb to the fear when it comes to this narrative, because actually this is an agenda that belongs to all of us. Diversity is not purely surface level. Diversity goes very deep, right into the roots of our childhood and the things that make us feel like we belong, which really is the root and center of what all of these initiatives are about. And something that we can certainly learn from with the diversity bursary fund is there are great things that organizations and people who are real advocates of initiatives like this can do to make a long-term sustainable difference. And then finally, I'll close on one of my favorite quotes from today's conversation, and that is around not only ensuring that we allow all different voices to be heard, but also that we keep an eye out for the underdog, because actually could be that underdog that ends up doing great things. And actually we should all not judge a book by its cover, as the saying goes.
No, that's good. Yeah, you never know. One day you might become the underdog. So, the shifting patterns of history can change very quickly sometimes. So, yeah. No, thank you for your time, and it's been lovely talking to you as ever. And appreciate you giving me the opportunity to spend the time with you.
Right back at you. My name is Leila McKenzie-Delis. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show, brought to you by Dial Global. If you'd like to find out any more information, check out the show notes at the end of today's show, or if you need any special access or a transcript, you can find us on all of your favorite podcast channels, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or you can visit us directly at www.dialglobal.org/podcast. See you again next week.